Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webcast, the $70 billion question, Keys to Unlocking the Potential of Donor-Advised Funds. I'd like to thank everyone who's attending today's webinar. Jody Rosen from Vanguard was initially scheduled to present, but she is unable to make it today, so we have another member of the Vanguard team, Cindy Van Amberg, who will be filling in. Cindy is the Senior Philanthropic Consultant with Vanguard, and our other presenter is Doug Schoenberg, who is the CEO at Software. I want to point out that today's session is being recorded, and the recording as well as the presentation slides will be sent via email after the presentation, so keep an eye out for that. And before we get started, I just want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's webinar. So you'll see here you can send in questions through this control panel, and on the left is your viewer window. That's where you'll be seeing the presentation. On the right is where you'll be able to send in your questions throughout the presentation. We'll save some time at the end to answer as many as possible. And at the upper right-hand corner, you should see this here, the audio mode for how you'll be listening in. The audio pane gives you information as far as using your computer's microphone and speakers or dialing in with the telephone. Everyone listening now has already figured this part out, but if at any point the audio cuts, you can try switching the setting there. To shrink the GoToWebinar panel, there is this little button here circled in red that can close and expand the panel when you want to participate. So with all that taken care of, I'm going to hand it over to Cindy now to get us started. Cindy?
Thanks. Thank you all for joining us today. I have a lot of information to share with you, and I do want to be sure that we use our time together to address your questions, any myths or realities you may have heard about donor-advised funds, as well as guide you in how to unlock the potential for your organization that lies within donor-advised funds. So before we take a deeper dive, I thought it may be helpful to tell you a little bit about myself and the role I play in the donor-advised fund space. For the past 5 years, I have spent time with high net worth donors and individuals and families and corporations who have a passion to support the causes they care about the most. I do that through my employment at a national donor-advised fund, Vanguard Charitable. So Vanguard Charitable has been in existence for 19 years. We just crossed the $6 billion in assets under management threshold. These assets are represented across 12,000 individual accounts and distribute more than $700 million annually to approximately 30,000 charities across the United States. So today, we want to talk about what a donor-advised fund is, for those of you that don't know, and how do they fit into the larger picture of charitable giving trends, and how can your organization unlock the potential held in donor-advised funds. We're also going to provide you with donors' perspective and learn how Doug benefits from using his donor-advised fund. So let's stop here and throw out a question, ask a poll question to the audience. Which best describes your impression of donor-advised funds? So while you're continuing to answer that question, I want to go into just the basics of how a donor-advised fund works. While there are nuances among the various supporting organizations, such as investment options, contribution minimums, in general, this is how they work. A DAF is a giving vehicle in which an individual contributes assets into an account and receives an immediate tax deduction. These funds can grow now tax-free and are then distributed to qualified nonprofit organizations over time based on the donor's granting preferences and their philanthropic goals. Donors can determine a legacy plan for the account for when they can no longer advise on the account, such as passing the account to their heirs, setting up recurring grants to one or many nonprofits, or having a lump sum distribution go to their charity of choice. So, something to think about. Do you know if you have donors who give to donor-advised funds? Do you communicate with them differently? We would argue that it is in your best interest to identify them so you can engage them through targeted messaging that will resonate with individuals who participate in donor-advised funds. I know that many of you tuning in may feel as though donor-advised funds serve as a barrier in connecting with your donors. But if you understand the motivation behind the donor's interest in creating and supporting a donor-advised fund and ask the right questions, you may be able to unlock giving potential as well as strengthen your relationship with your donor, which is so important. And I know maybe one of those barriers and one of your concerns could possibly be the fact that donors can grant to charity through donor-advised funds anonymously. But Vanguard Charitable did our donors over a 10-year period and found that only 5% of the grants issued are anonymous. So that other 95%, it's important for you to communicate with those donors, thank those donors for that gift, and certainly you can acknowledge the fact that you understand it came from a donor-advised fund. So when you know someone is donating from a donor-advised fund, there are some assumptions that you can make. No. This person tends to be more strategic with their giving and have identified you as an organization on their short list. When we think about a strategic donor, we think about someone who follows a long-term plan that includes a budget, investment strategy, and appropriate time horizon that will allow the individual to meet both current and long-term giving objectives. There is also a greater potential for annual giving because you identified that there is a subset of money that is already earmarked for philanthropy. There is the opportunity for this individual to support larger projects. Again, that money is already earmarked for charitable purposes. Donors have the ability to set up recurring grants. That can provide you with a reasonably predictable income stream, allowing you to budget more effectively. And like we discussed, there are legacy giving opportunities. Many of you have planned giving specialists who are seeking deferred dollars to support your organization. Just as that individual can include you in their estate plans, they have the capacity to name your organization as an ultimate recipient of donor-advised fund assets. So we feel you should be communicating differently with the individuals you have identified as having given with a donor-advised fund. Talk to them about how they structure their philanthropic giving, which vehicle they use for which causes. So why is this so important? Why do we all tune in today seeking to learn about how to unlock the potential of DAFs? It's because donor-advised funds, year after year, are becoming an increasingly popular way to manage, grow, and distribute charitable dollars. They have evolved to be the giving tool of choice for many individuals, and partly due to their simplicity, the low cost, tax effectiveness, and their flexibility. So look at this chart. You will note that there are more than 200,000 individual donor-advised accounts that exist across the United States. 12,000 of those are within Vanguard Charitable. So while donor-advised funds are the most utilized on this chart, you will note several giving tools that a donor may choose when distributing their charitable dollars. These tools may be used alone or may be used to complement one another. So the way in which donors are giving really is changing, and new charitable tools and technologies continue to emerge. There's an increased focus on having a giving strategy and setting goals for donations. The definition of social good is evolving as well, with terms like impact investing. We need to remain flexible in fundraising, and we may be left behind. We need to see this as an opportunity, but it is up to us as nonprofits to be thoughtful, creative, and intentional about how we engage with donors. Because the bottom line is donors who are strategic with their philanthropy and are informed about their options will choose giving tools that best support their overall plans, including an effective tax strategy. So let's look at the next chart and see that donor advised funds now maintain more than $70 billion in assets under management. That's a 23% growth from 2013. They receive annual contributions of more than $20 billion, which is a 14% increase from 2013. So think about how you solicit that. The good news is the average annual payout for donor advised funds has remained fairly constant at 21.5%, which provides approximately $12.5 billion to charity annually. Now, donor advised funds are giving away assets at a much higher rate than other giving vehicles, versus the private foundation required minimum distribution of 5%. That 21.5%, is much higher. And the other good news is the average size of donor advised funds accounts has increased and is close to about $300,000 now. And by the way, within the DAF space, national providers such as Vanguard Charitable, Fidelity Charitable, and Schwab Charitable represent more than 50% of the market share. So our goal at Vanguard Charitable is to educate people on how being strategic with their giving can support philanthropic and financial plans while creating an impact on the causes about which our donors care most. And it comes down to really three basic questions. Why? Why is philanthropy important to me? What do I have to give away? And how? How do I want to accomplish this? The more educated you as the nonprofit can be in strategic giving, the better you will be able to connect your donors and unlock the potential of their giving. It allows you to have a deeper dialogue, provide value, and deeper relationships. When I'm talking to individuals who I believe, based on their financial and philanthropic goals, will benefit from a donor advised fund, I share this slide. To highlight some of the key reasons why a DAF is right for them and why, as we have always talked about, the popularity in donor advised funds has grown exponentially over the last several years. So this is where I think it would be great for Doug to come in and talk about his experience with the donor advised fund and how it's worked for him.
Thanks, Cindy. Again, welcome everyone. Though I am the CEO of Software, the provider of Donor Perfect, which I know many of you use, my participation today is as a philanthropic person and someone who's had a donor advised fund for a number of years. This topic started, and my involvement with Vanguard Charitable started a few years ago when I did a blog post called Why I Love My Donor Advised Fund. And in it, I talked about all the benefits that I had experienced. And it's really a pretty simple story for me, which is that for a long time, I have felt that being philanthropic was important, and I have given to a number of different organizations over the years. But I also like to be tax efficient. And one of the strategies that I had often used was the idea of giving appreciated securities to nonprofits. And of course, that's possible to do without a donor advised fund. And what I would do is if there were 5 different nonprofits that I wanted to give to, I'd have to go and work with each one of those individual nonprofits, get their information about their brokerage account, send a letter to my brokerage contact asking for the shares to be transferred. Then after I did that, I had to worry about whether that transfer happened. I had to worry about getting information, notification and recognition of the gift, and invariably it would turn into a large, time-consuming hassle for me. Some smaller nonprofits that I wanted to give to didn't have brokerage accounts. Some transactions didn't go through. In many cases, I'd get a letter recognizing my donation that wasn't correct, and I'd have to go back to the nonprofit. So, quite frankly, the whole experience, sort of was a bit disheartening. When I discovered donor-advised funds and created a donor-advised fund at Vanguard, it has dramatically changed my experience and for the better, and I think contributed to a greater degree of philanthropy, as I'll speak to in a minute. And in short, what it allows me to do is, rather than giving individual gifts of stock to each nonprofit, I make a single gift of stock to Vanguard, and those and they've created a very efficient and effective system for me to do so. So, I always get the acknowledgement that I need, and that I have the information on file for where the shares get transferred. And from there, I'm able to still go and very easily, in their case, it's an online system that allows me, whenever I want to make a grant request or recommendation to a nonprofit, I log into their online system. If it's a nonprofit I've given to before, I just select it from the list, fill in the information about how much I want to give, press submit, and I'm done. If it's a new nonprofit, well, it's a little bit more work. I have to either look and see if they're on their list already, or if not, I put in some basic information about the nonprofit, like the address and things along those lines, and they take care of the rest. In the past, because of the hassle factor, I wouldn't really consider making a gift of appreciated stock unless I was giving several $1,000s to an organization. With Vanguard, their minimum gift is $500, correct? Yeah, $500. And so I frequently give smaller gifts, and it's no more work to make a smaller gift than a larger gift. And as a result, quite frankly, there are many times when an organization might have been someone who I might have given perhaps $100 to or $200 to, and oftentimes they'll say, you know what, I'm just going to do it for my donor advised fund, and they get $500. And so that's good for them. And in truth, because of the tax efficiency of the process, for me, it actually just allows me to multiply the effectiveness of my giving. The other point that I want to make about donor-advised funds that I think oftentimes people don't fully understand and appreciate is represented by this chart. So I know it's a little complicated, but well, let's start with let me see. I guess we'll start with the blue, the area under the lowest area, which is blue. So that represents the account balance that I have at Vanguard. And you can see when I first started the account in 2007, it was relatively low. In 2011, I had a stock that had done tremendously well, and I was thinking, well, I could sell it, but I'd have a large capital gain, and I decided instead to contribute it to my donor advised fund. And so you can see that for several years, there were some relatively large contributions that I made. But one of the great things for a donor about a donor advised fund is it disconnects the timing of when you might make the gift of stock from when you might put it to philanthropic purposes. Now, different donors, as I understand it, are really different. Some people contribute each year to their donor advised fund and then distribute most of that money each year. But many donors, including me, sort of view it as a philanthropic savings account. So, at periods of time where I might, have a stock that I want to contribute. I may put a lot away, and I know that I'm going to be giving that out over time in the future. And that really is critical in my mind about how you as a nonprofit leader should think about donor-advised funds and think about donors who have donor-advised funds. It's a good indicator that you have someone that they might have given you $1,000 or $5,000 or whatever it is, but there's a very good chance that you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg. And that iceberg is going to melt in the future, as it were, and you want to be able to benefit from that. The other reason why I think of it as a philanthropic savings account is that the money in that donor-advised fund is no longer part of my estate, okay, but it is earning, it is invested by Vanguard in Vanguard funds that I select. And so there's the ability for that to accumulate over time. So what this graph is trying to represent is this idea that the amount of charitable impact is actually above and beyond just the dollars that I contribute directly, because there's a potential for that to grow over time. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to share with you guys were a few tips, from my experience as a donor-advised fund donor and working with quite a number of different non-profits. Donor-advised funds are subject to a variety of rules around how they operate. One of the most essential rules is this idea that I can't get any, even though I am the person making the recommendation, ultimately the donation is coming from Vanguard. And therefore, I can't make a pledge and fulfill it with a grant from a donor-advised fund, because that would be fulfilling a commitment that I had, made as it relates to it. So if you're an organization that asks for pledges, let's say you're doing a capital campaign, et cetera, when you're dealing with someone who has a donor-advised fund, all you really have to do is change your language, okay? Instead of asking them to make a pledge, ask them to make a commitment to recommend a grant to the organization, and it can be a multi-year commitment in terms of that. Another tip that I have, which is that I think oftentimes there's a little bit of confusion around when you get a donation from Vanguard, and I was the grantor, about who is the actual donor, okay? And so very often I will get a thank you letter that says, thank you for making your donation. Okay, and to read the letter, you would, doesn't acknowledge the fact that it came via donor-advised fund. Now, there may be a few donors who like that, because in theory, you could try and use that as a demonstration of a gift that you're not really entitled to claim. But the correct way to recognize that donation is to thank me for recommending the grant, but that the donation has actually come from Vanguard. And it's a simple thing to do within a software product like Donor Perfect or in most fundraising systems, because of the idea of being able to have a soft credit and being able to establish one person as the donor and soft credit to another person. Or I know some of our customers will actually record, they'll have a donation record for me for my donor-advised fund, and they'll note and acknowledge that that donation came, from there, and recognize that with a different donation letter. Another thing that many people don't know and understand about donor-advised funds, at least Vanguard, and I assume, Cindy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's about others, is that, Vanguard allows me to set up a recurring grant request. So, actually, believe it or not, this morning, before I came into the office, my wife said, that there was an organization that we support that has a multi-year project that they're working on, and I went online this morning and set up a 5-year payment gift schedule request for a grant. And in the same way that recurring gifts are wonderful from the perspective of improving donor retention, same idea with a donor-advised fund gift. And so certainly you can consider asking someone like me, who maybe is making gifts through a donor-advised fund, whether I might consider making a multi-year grant recommendation. And the last point that I would really make as it relates to donor-advised fund donors is that you should certainly think about them as having the potential of being major donors, okay? Even if, you're getting a $500 gift, I think some donor-advised funds even have slightly lower minimums, perhaps $250. It's a very good indicator, as Cindy indicated, that this is someone who's maybe taking a more strategic view of philanthropy. And I can, speaking for myself, I'm happy to engage with nonprofits that I support to help them understand why I use a donor-advised funds, what my thoughts are. One of the other things that's important to realize about a donor-advised fund is that there are multiple options at death for people who are who have a donor-advised fund. I could establish a charity as the recipient of all those remaining funds upon my death. In my particular case, I'm trying to teach my children the value and importance of philanthropy, so I'm more likely to transition the remaining assets to them so that they can continue to be philanthropic through this wonderful tool and device. So, we've covered a lot already, and I know we've gotten a lot of questions. So let's turn and try and answer a few of those.
Okay, I have a few right here. So one of them is there a maximum number of nonprofits that you can give to annually through Vanguard Charitable? No, there's not. So we have donors that will make one grant a year to a charity. There's a possibility that they've been growing the account to give a major gift to one of their nonprofits. Or you can give to 50 or 60
well,
nonprofits.
In point of fact, so I intended to mention it, but, I've had my donor-advised fund for a little less than 10 years, okay? And over those 10 years, I've given to about 70 different nonprofits and made almost 300 separate individual donations, over that period of time. But again, that's me. As you pointed out, some people have a more narrow and targeted approach to this.
Right. And another question is there a minimum distribution annually, from a donor-advised fund? So unlike a private foundation where they must give out a required minimum distribution of 5%, on an account-by-account basis within Vanguard Charitable, Doug doesn't have to give out anything in a given year. He could wait a year or two if he's trying to develop a philanthropic plan. But see, we talked about the 21.5% distribution from the donor-advised funds. So, in any given year since our inception for 19 years, we've given between 15 and 20% through Vanguard Charitable. But the average across donor-advised funds is 21%. So you can see there that donors are giving every year. So I think they're looking at us as on an aggregate. So on an aggregate, we have promised the IRS that we'll give out 5% of our fund at Vanguard Charitable. But we clearly give out much more than that through the generosity of our donors.
Which is one of the things that also, again, makes it nice as a donor that you have more flexibility in terms of how you can use it. One of the questions that several people have asked is about the idea of how they can identify donors who have, when they get a contribution from Vanguard, how they can identify who the donor is. So, I can speak to it, I think, from my perspective, and then I'll let Cindy speak to it. So, when I make that donation, there is an option if I want to make my gift anonymous. Okay, and I don't choose to do that, and I think you indicated that the vast majority of Vanguard donors don't choose to make it anonymous. And in fact, I can also even suggest how I would like the gift to be recognized, whether I want it to be from the Schoenberg family trust, or from Doug and Lisa Schoenberg, or the Schoenberg family, et cetera. Obviously, Cindy can't necessarily speak for all donor-advised funds, but why don't you speak generally to the issue of
Sure.
anonymity and or the ability to learn who donations.
Sure. Like I said, 95% of our donors are giving and giving a name of who's sending the grant. So we do give them a lot of options where they can give their fund name, or they can even, you've got a lot of people that are using donor advised funds like it's a private foundation. So you may have a family of two brothers that each have 5 siblings, and they may even have kids. So you may have 15 people involved in one donor advised fund. They have the opportunity to name one person that is the recognized individual that's sending the grant. They also have the ability to do the grant in honor of someone or in memory of someone. And all of that is listed in the payment that we send to you, to the nonprofit. So we'll send a check on behalf of the donor, and we send a letter that's included with that check that has the donor's wishes on it. So if that letter comes into a development office with the check, and whatever department it's going to within the charity, that letter needs to go on to the department. So that department knows exactly who to thank, and who to recognize for having given that grant. I think that's a really good question.
So another question that seems to be being asked by a few different people in different ways really has to do with this idea of figuring out who at Vanguard is the right person to speak to, or things along those lines. And I think it relates to what is oftentimes a common misperception, I think. In my case, and in most cases, Vanguard is not making decisions about where these assets go. Okay, I'm making them. I am the account owner and the decider about this philosophy. So you shouldn't, in general, it may not be a bad idea to try and develop good relationships with people who help donors at donor advised funds, but I don't look to Vanguard to say, hey, what would be a really good charity for me to give to?
Right.
Okay.
And that might be a little bit different for nonprofits in that they work often with community foundations.
Mm-hmm.
So community foundations within them do have and offer donor advised funds. But community foundations also offer a lot of other things. They have field of interest funds, and they have the ability to, take donors through their community, and if they're interested in something very specific in that community, a community foundation may recommend some nonprofits that are going on in that community. A national donor advised fund like Vanguard Charitable, Schwab Charitable, Fidelity Charitable, we are just that. We are only offering a donor advised fund. We all remain cause neutral. So your relationship, you want the relationship you have to be with the donor that's sending the assets through their donor advised fund, not necessarily the donor advised fund. The only thing I can say about the nonprofit's relationship with the donor advised fund is on the grant side. We may have a question about a grant. like I think there was a question up there about, can you get any personal benefit? So can you give to a charity that is having an event and you get a table at the event? So that's not fully tax deductible. So our grants team is going to look at that because the donor has gotten the charitable tax deduction. When they put the assets into Vanguard Charitable, all the assets going out of Vanguard Charitable have to be that same type of tax deduction. So if our grants team takes a look at a grant and has a question about whether this is fully tax deductible or if the donor is going to get a benefit back, we're going to reach out to the nonprofit and talk to you about it. So if we can work together to streamline that process, that's the benefit of your donor and the benefit of our donor. So we definitely want to work closely together on that grant side for sure.
And I'll make another little tip as it relates to it, because I have had situations where, there was an event and I was asked, would I be a sponsor and it entitled me to, a table or whatever it was. And I have done that through my donor advised fund. But what I've said to the nonprofit is, this is a donation. I cannot receive any direct benefit back. So to the degree that I'm going to attend the event, I'll buy tickets separately for the event. That said, a wonderful thing that you could do, is to perhaps if a donor did that, to say, you've been such a wonderful supporter of our organization, we'd like to give you 2 tickets to the event. As long as there's no quid pro quo involved, that's an allowable transaction, and it really is a way to sort of, build that, connection with the donor and recognize that, there are some things about how they're choosing to give that may not fit into your traditional model of sponsorship and things along those lines.
Right. So things can be worked out. Like our grants team can work with the nonprofit, and we are feeling like nonprofits are getting more savvy about grants that are coming from a donor advised fund and separating that out, or when they're getting a nice donation from a donor, simply inviting them to the event. Invite them. That was a nice donation. Thank you. We would love for you to come. Without their
forget that donation. You've been a long time supporter of the organization.
Come.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We want to have you there.
Right. And then there are a couple of questions about grants that we deny. I can tell you that 99.9% of the grants that go out, go out. The grants that are asked, are requested, go out. Very few are denied. It's mainly about, if the nonprofit is still in good standing with the IRS, meaning that they've done their could put their 990 in to the IRS for the last 3 years. There's very few times have we denied a grant outright. It could be about that personal benefit that the donor is getting benefit back. I mean, a donor certainly can't give to their university athletic department and receive football tickets for the whole fall. So some of those things are where we will stop that, but the donor then ends up trying to choose how to donate that grant in a different way to the university. And then somebody asked about if we deny grants with the legacy option. So when a donor establishes a donor advised fund, we do ask them right at the onset to set up a legacy plan. And if their legacy plan lists nonprofits, we will vet those nonprofits here and now. So if there is any trouble, we could go to the donor right then and there and tell them that that nonprofit is not in good standing or something. That's actually never happened, but we do vet those nonprofits right now, so the donor is all set with that legacy plan.
One of the other questions that I saw someone had asked was advice about how to speak to donors about their donor advised funds and what to talk to them about. And I think in general my advice is, first of all, to the degree that you know that someone has a donor advised fund and is a supporter of your organization, I would not object at all to be asked fairly directly about it. When and why do you choose to use your donor-advised fund as opposed to making donations directly? What are your thoughts about the disposition of the remaining assets? I prefer you probably ask me that question when I'm a little bit older than I am today. But so I think that that's fine, and I do think that a nonprofit has the opportunity, in many cases, to be a source of a certain amount of expertise to donors. So I think at this point I'm a pretty knowledgeable donor advisor. Maybe Cindy can correct me if I'm wrong as it relates to it. Well, it's a combination of things. I've had one for a while. We've done a few of these sessions together, so I've learned a fair amount in that process. And obviously, our business is very much nonprofit focused, so I'm interested in that side of it as well. But many donors don't fully know and take advantage of the ability to donate appreciated stock. Many people just make a straight cash donation to a donor advised fund. Nothing wrong with that, but there is that potential for them to increase their effectiveness. Or I'm sure many of you do get direct donations of stock from a donor, and I at least would have welcomed a nonprofit that said to me, hey, I know you want to give us this stock and we're really appreciative, but have you ever thought about setting up a donor advised fund and doing it through it? You might even describe, oh, I have a donor advised fund, and it could make your processes and life easier as well as that for the donor, and it's again part of building that connection and relationship. So those are a few ideas of how I might like to be engaged around that kind of conversation.
Yeah, I think that's good to hear, and I can tell that there are some questions about how can we find who these people are that have donor advised funds. How can we tap into that market, which I understand your interest there. And, I would say that ask. Just like you have donors that are giving from private foundations or donors giving through their checkbook, there are donors that are giving through their checkbook that do also have donor advised funds. So, sometimes you'll have a form where you say, check this box if you have included us in your will. You could always add something like check this box if you have a donor advised fund. Or if you have a donor that's giving securities and it's kind of a problem for them, or it's not so easy, you may recommend a donor advised fund. It makes you look savvy in all the giving vehicles that are out there, and that your interest is in helping your donor find the best way and easiest way to get their assets to the nonprofit.
One other comment that I will make, again, there's no directory of who these 238,000 people, are, but there can be things that might be an indicator. So I know some of you use, wealth screening services, or do research on donors. And certainly, if you're looking at a record where you see someone has made a gift to an organization through the Schoenberg Charitable Trust, you can't be sure that that's a donor advised fund as opposed to an individual donation. But again, it's a pretty good indicator that perhaps they're using vehicles. And I often see, roll calls of, recognition lists, et cetera, that might be indicators of that.
Well, you'll definitely see, most often you'll see charitable fund. Mm-hmm. So you won't often see, the word foundation or the word endowment or actually the word trust, because legally that's not what we are. So most donor advised accounts end in the word fund. So, the Jones Family Charitable Fund, Smith's Family Giving Account Fund. So that can give you an indication. And I guess I should point out right now,
there are a lot of you on this webinar, and we're getting lots of questions. It's unlikely that we're going to necessarily get to answer all of them here. We'll try and answer certainly some more and as many of them as we can. What we may do afterwards is try and synthesize some of these questions into frequently asked questions and perhaps put together some written answers that we might be able to offer to people who are interested in it. But that is not to say that we don't want additional questions, because obviously these are great questions and we're happy to answer them. I see a question about, what happens when a stock is donated to a donor-advised fund. I think in almost all cases, the stock is sold and converted into to cash. Donor-advised, organizations like Vanguard Charitable are not really in the business of retaining and holding assets. That's kind of the scenario that perhaps someone might create a personal foundation for, things along those lines. But again, from my perspective, that's perfectly fine. One of the things that has been interesting, we've tended to talk about donor-advised funds as an efficient giving vehicle for appreciated stock. But the reality is that there's other kinds of assets as well that can benefit from the same favorable tax treatment of eliminating capital gains treatment. Obviously not, so there are mechanisms today at many donor-advised funds for someone to give real estate or artwork or things along those lines. Again, it's going to typically be in a model where it's going to be sold and the proceeds, become the asset in the donor-advised fund. Stocks are probably cash and stocks are the easiest assets to deal with, but it is not exclusively restricted to that.
Yeah, and I'm also seeing a couple of questions that, talk a little bit about what interest areas are mostly being given through donor-advised funds. There was also a question about, do donor-advised funds use GuideStar, or do their donors use GuideStar? So with some of those questions, I may suggest not that you have the capacity. I know we are all nonprofits and we're at capacity in all the work that we have to do, but if you have somebody in your offices that could maybe peruse some of the donor-advised fund websites, you could actually see we have a resource center where we list resources for our donors. GuideStar is a big one because GuideStar lists all nonprofits across the United States. We also, like Vanguard Charitable, and I'm pretty sure Fidelity just did one as well, a survey to our donors and, what their giving patterns were, who they were giving to, how often they were giving, and that is on our website. Our thought leadership piece that is the result of our survey is called An Inside Look, and you can find that on our website. And it does say that 35% of the funds going out are for human services. 25% is education, 12% is religion, 8% civic, 6% health. So it goes on from there. So you can find a wealth of information on the websites of donor-advised funds to kind of learn more about their donors. And also the resources that we are suggesting for our donors. I mean, because our donors are being more strategic, they're looking for that philanthropic consultative conversation. So we are trying to, through the Resource Center, give them, some ideas of how they have that conversation with their family. What's the best tool for them to gift? That kind of thing. So you can find a lot out there on the website.
Great. Another question that I've seen several people ask is really around the best practice or most appropriate way to record the gift, and presumably that would be within Donor Perfect or in whatever tool you're using for managing that. And it looked like the question some people were asking, well, is this a gift from an individual or is this a gift from a corporation or a grant or an entity? Well, in truth, within since that doesn't, as far as I'm aware, have any material difference to anyone other than your organization, how you want to think about it, I'm not sure that it really matters whether you thought of it and represented it as an individual gift or an entity gift. I think that the and the other side of this is this question about whether to so you could have one donor in your database that was Vanguard charitable, okay? And you could record all these gifts as coming from Vanguard charitable and then soft credit the individual donor's record. And since Vanguard charitable is not an individual, it is an entity, I would categorize it that way. Again, remembering that, even though they are the conduit for those funds, they're not the decider. So, there's no real requirement for you to provide them, like Vanguard, a gift acknowledgement. I'm sure you get sent many of them, and I assume that for the most part, that's completely unnecessary. Even more to the point, there's no real reason to invite them to your gala next year, okay? Or to send them, a solicitation and things along those lines. So save your money, okay? Mark that record as one that, doesn't require that kind of communication. But me as the individual, yes. Another way that you could absolutely do it and record it is, if I always give through my donor advised fund, or if I sometimes do, you can have a record for me, that says that, the Douglas Schoenberg Charitable, Trust. And in that scenario, it's all, it is me as an individual. I would consider that an individual and record that donation there. Again, recognizing that those donations are, coming through this conduit entity, et cetera. So, that's kind of my best advice for you. And obviously, to the degree that you're a customer of ours, certainly you can always, there may be individual circumstances for you that might drive one preferred method or another, and I'd encourage you to speak to our support team, or I think we've created, and if we haven't, we certainly will create sort of a best practices guide for donor advised funds and incorporate that into our client knowledge base.
Yeah, and there's still some other questions about all the different donor advised funds and what are their minimum amounts and things like that. They do vary pretty vastly, and it really kind of depends on the philanthropic wishes of your client. You can open an account at some donor advised funds for as low as $5,000. Vanguard Charitable's minimum is $25,000. There are some lower grant minimums as well, and Vanguard Charitable, like Doug said, is $500. And you can also find that information out on all of the websites. I did see that there was a question about the fact that they've read something about, donor advised funds are just a vehicle to hold the assets and not get them onto charity. And I do want to respond to that because, I think it is important to know that although this is a giving vehicle for people to receive a charitable tax deduction in one given year and not have to disperse all of that out to charity at once, it is allowing you, you are not giving the charitable tax deduction to the donor. So a donor is being able to send it out to 5 different charities without having for the charity to have to give them the tax deduction. We give them the tax deduction. But just know that, yes, So across the donor advised fund space, 21.5% of those dollars are going out to charity every year. And when you think about $70 billion sitting in donor advised funds, that's a lot of money going out to charity every year. So, you know, the donors are very generous. They're just really strategic and very thoughtful.
Okay, well, we're coming to the end of our committed hours, so I'd like to just turn to wrap up, and as I said, we'll try and figure out the best way to more broadly answer all these great questions, but we very much appreciate everyone's comments.
Right, so let's just do a couple of takeaways, and I'll just take a minute to do this. I mean, you know, at Vanguard Charitable and throughout the industry, we need to be looking at how best we can serve these donors. So, you know, engage your donors through a consultative dialogue. You know, understand what are their drivers for giving. What are their philanthropic goals? How do those goals intersect with their financial plans? You know, is it securities, or do they have some special asset that they don't need anymore and they're trying to figure out how, you know, how to donate it, and they didn't even realize they could donate it? You know, target your communications based on your donor segments. Think of how you might approach your donors with donor advised funds differently than donors who primarily give through their checkbook. And, you know, think of how you want to communicate with donor advised funds. When they call with a question regarding a grant, you know, what is your process and timing for responding to them? How can you facilitate communication to resolve any issues that may arise? You know, like I said before, we're all looking to streamline the process with our donors, your donors and our donors. Think about that planned giving opportunity. That's a very large opportunity for you. You know, I mean, just like I said, you may want to, you know, include on your information forms where you put the checkbox. This is, you know, check here if we're included in your will. You may want to ask them whether they have a donor advised fund in that area. You know, as we talked about earlier, you know, philanthropy is evolving, and we all need to be able to adapt. So if nothing else, I hope you see that donor advised funds are not a gatekeeper between you and your donors. In reality, you know, the knowledge that your donor has a donor advised fund, it provides you with a, you know, treasure chest of information that you have the power to, you know, unlock.
All right. So we are out of time. Thanks again to Cindy and Doug for sharing your knowledge on these donor advised funds. As I had mentioned in the beginning of the recording will be sent of today's session to all registrants, and we'll also work with Doug and Cindy to get written responses to the questions that went unanswered. And we're also going to include a link for you to download our free ebook, The 9 Facts Every Nonprofit Should Know About Donor Advised Funds. So you'll find some further information in there that may not have been included in today's presentation. Vanguard would also like to send the attendees of this webinar information related to thought leadership relevant to nonprofits. So if you prefer your email address is not shared with Vanguard for this purpose, just please enter your email into the question box now. And thanks again for everyone for attending. Keep an eye out for the email with the recording and questions. And our next expert webcast will be on November 19th, Donors, Data, and Dollars, Benchmarks for Your Fundraising Work. So again, you can look for an email to register for that in the near future. So thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon.